Hello, welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. As usual, I'm Tina. Today I'm doing a book review of Idolfire by Grace Curtis. This is a book from Daw, coming out March 11th, 2024. It is a fantasy novel. I received this arc from NetGalley in exchange for a fair review. Apparently, third time is the charm, because while I enjoyed Grace Curtis's Frontier and The Floating Hotel, I absolutely adored Idolfire. I loved this book. I loved it. So prepare for a very enthusiastic review. What is it about, first of all? On one side of the world, Alea Anu Ulai is desperate for a chance. Her family has written her off as a mistake, but she's determined to prove every last one of them wrong. On the other, Kirby of Wall's End is searching for redemption. An ancient curse tore her life apart, but to fix it, she'll have to leave everything behind. Fate sets them both on the path to Nivella, a city once poised to conquer the world with the power of 1,000 stolen gods. Now the gates are closed and the old magic slumbers, dead, or waiting for a spark to light it anew. So I'm going to read the little tagline. A character-driven science fantasy road trip book with sword fights and a slow burn romance, Idolfire delves into the vastness of history and the terrifying power of organized faith. I don't know how much that really applies. I'm going to tell you my take on it. So, this is a fantasy inspired by the fall of Rome, but you don't need to know that going in, and quite frankly, the story stands well on its own without knowing any of that. I forgot that when I went into it, and while I was some of this sounds familiar, some of this seems like it should be based on reality, I didn't realize until the acknowledgement at the end that I was like, oh, okay, I was right. So you don't need to know that going in. If you aren't a fan of Rome, if I had to choose a culture that this book was focused on, it's not actually Rome at all, but the outlying civilizations that survive after the fall of it. In fact, Rome is kind of made fun of in this book a little bit, which I thought was refreshing. My favorite aspect of the book is tied to the world building, which is that there's a quest narrative, and my favorite kind where the characters aren't in a super rush to get home. They have a mission and a goal, but it's not a 3-day adventure. It's a month-long journey. And they get to so many cool and interesting places, both in the cultures and in the odd magic that they encounter along the way. The different countries and places are described really well, with lush descriptions that aren't afraid to take their time unfolding. I found it very immersive. I absolutely loved the world building. I wanted to go there. And the magic system is subtle in that it's almost kind of rare to have magic, but when it does come up, it's so fascinating. I can't even describe what was my favorite place they visited, as all of them had such cool and unique features. The book also has ancient ruins, a trope that I love. Actually, no, I do know what my favorite part was. I'm not going to spoil it, but of course it has to do with a ship, like a boat. More specifically, the figurehead of the boat. If you've read the book, or if for some reason the author's watching this, you know what I'm talking about. That part was wild. That was kind of the point in the book where I was like, I'm going to love this book. I've already decided I'm going to love this book. So there's two main perspectives, with a third coming in later. It's third person. Thankfully, as you know, I'm not a super fond of first person. The two women, Elia and Kirby, are vastly different in temperament and skill and knowledge and social position. And they're pretty much opposite as they could be, but they work well together, and you get to witness their reluctant alliance and then relationship blossom over time. I will say, though, the only critique I have of the novel is that the yearning aspects of the slow burn romance were not intense at all. I know there's a whole subset of fantasy readers who don't want sex in their fantasy. They think it should be reserved for romantasy. But as someone who doesn't like to read romantasy because I can't stand most of the tropes, I like romance and sex in my fantasy because I'm not going to read a romantasy. I'm not even asking for a sex scene. Just like in the case of this book, a bit more sexual tension, a little bit more pining, a little bit more kind of will they, won't they, would have worked nicely for me. That would have just upped this to amazing. I mean, it already was a fantastic book, but it just would have given it that little bit of spark. That being said, Curtis's skill at characterization really shines in this novel because she's able to make you care about the most officious little prick of a character, one that you really wish would get a comeuppance, but then she humanizes them and you're like, damn, you made me like this person and actually care about them, a person that in real life I would avoid. So that was actually really fun. It also showed how most of the time, we're assholes to other people because of how we're raised or where we live, kind of the culture that we exist within. And I thought that was kind of a really interesting take, even though it wasn't super, it was subtle, I guess. It wasn't, it obviously wasn't the point of the book, but it was something that I felt was relevant to today. The action scenes are terse and exciting and very fun. Kirby can't fight at all, but Elia definitely can, though she's not infallible. She's had years of training, but she's also quick-witted. Yet Kirby helps as best she can, and while she does come off as a bit of like a country bumpkin at times, she's quite endearing and cute in that regard. It's very much a grumpy sunshine story. And then a third chaos element comes in, kind of mix things up in the last third of the book that was actually added to the dynamic very well. I think that was balanced quite well. The ending is one of the most interesting ones I've read because both women have responsibilities back home, and you're well aware of this the entire time, and that's kind of part of the tension of the book. You're like, if these two develop a friendship, what's gonna happen? And how this was addressed was bittersweet and realistic. This is not a save the world story. It's about two women doing what they have to do for themselves and for their communities. There's a wider world that exists around them, and the book is great at showing how the world doesn't revolve around them as main characters. They're just like part of the world. You know, I might be reading into it a bit much, but the book also seems to include the physical manifestations of the effects of colonialism, at least like the theft of cultural artifacts, at least pointing out how that is problematic and can cause problems down the line, as we kind of know. Overall, if you couldn't tell, I really, really liked this book. I loved it. The length was perfect. The story didn't follow a straight trajectory, but it wasn't meandering. The characters are excellent, and the world building and action scenes are top notch. I highly recommend it. If you are into fantasy, just in general, like it, I don't know why that little blurb thinks that it was like a science fantasy or why it was a road trip, because it's definitely none of that. But it's definitely a very great detailed adult fantasy, and I really liked it. So thank you again to NetGalley and to the publisher for the e-arc. I really appreciated it.